our first presentation is Politicizing Muslim Mental Health Towards a Decolonial Movement by Dr. Tarek Younis, who's a lecturer in psychology at Middlesex University. He researches and writes on Islamophobia, racism and mental health, and the securitization of clinical settings. He teaches on the impact of culture, religion, globalization, and security policies with mental health.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm guessing I'm starting right away, right? I'm just going to put a timer. So I have, well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for organizing this really inspiring conference. And I'm also very appreciative of the theme that was chosen for this year. I think it really is indicative of the sort of the spirit of the time. So I'm really happy to be a part of this as well. So I'll be speaking today about politicizing Muslim mental health and sort of what that entails for decoloniality. It really relates to my own research and sort of background. Personally, I'm a cultural psychologist, and I've always been interested in sort of how issues of culture, politics, among other things, sort of relate within the mental health setting, which has been sort of primarily my research in general. So I need to just mention here, I'm never actually going to define what I mean by politicizing. So I'm just going to go ahead and begin by stating that the way I'm referring to it relates to power. And so I'm relating, when I'm speaking to political, I'm relating to that by these processes by which those in power are able to maintain their positions of power. And often this relates to statecraft. And that's just going to be a very sort of basic way of relating to political here. So I'm going to start off with this really small sort of quote by Philip Cushman, who wrote a really great book called Constructing the Self-Constructing America. And he says that there's more to the exercise of power than overt coercion and repression, and more to the ills of our age than the absence of community and tradition. Therapists think that because they believe that the patient's mental health will automatically translate into a correct political position, they're not contributing to the status quo. And I thought that was a really, I mean, these are two separate quotes, but I thought together, they encapsulate a little bit of sort of the issues that have always sort of pervaded in mental health discourse. And I'm talking here particularly about the disciplines of psychology and psychiatry, and the sort of politics of psychology and psychiatry, which have well been documented in terms of how they relate to the state itself. So to this, I'm going to just relate just to a few more authors and why I think this work is this type of, or the significance of the political is so important when it comes to Muslim mental health professionals. So obviously there's Mahmoud Bahul, we're talking about liberation psychology. You know, he has related to the fact that psychologists are often serving the status quo. Now, across the global north, many people have already written about this. Primarily, I think one of the biggest writers is obviously Foucault himself, who and post-structuralists, who have related to how the side disciplines have played an essential role in defining what is normality, what is abnormal, and in doing so, serving particular interests of the state. Huat has recently been writing about this as well, not necessarily in terms of psychology per se, but as he relates to how the political is all encompassing. So it touches upon all the fields. And so there's no way to think of mental health or even Muslim mental health as an apolitical discipline. Much more closer to home now, in terms of also my more recent writings that I've published elsewhere. There's James Nolan, there's Lash, there's other people who have written particularly about this day and age. What is the utility of the side disciplines in this day and age? And there's this point of the therapeutic ethos. So this idea of psychology talk, which has become very convenient to obscure political issues and to sort of evade the social and political issues which might exist in society. And I'm going to talk about the importance of psychologization later. Here, I just want to note very quickly, as I've been following the fields for a very long time, I'm not going to make a distinction now between Islamic psychology and Muslim mental health. Right now, as long as you are a Muslim mental health professional, or you are someone who's interested in Muslim mental health, that is sufficient that these things are addressed to you. I think probably I was very grateful for Mohammed Sidet's article. For anyone who hasn't read it, I should have maybe shared the title here. He wrote about signifying a sort of decolonial Islamic psychology. And he also relates to sort of the points that I'm trying to get at, which is that he says that the literature on Islam and psychology does not engage explicitly with the lurking influences of coloniality of power, knowledge, and being on the formation of hegemonic and counter-hegemonic psychologies. So there's an element here whereby whatever we are trying to produce, whatever we're trying to invoke in terms of what a Muslim mental health will be, will necessarily have to address conditions of power, will necessarily have to be politicized. And to that, for him, he offers these three rubrics, which would, pave the way in a way to a sort of decoloniality within Muslim mental health. Now, I can't go through these, and he's obviously much better to speak about his own work. He speaks about epistemic freedom, humanization. But for me, what's important in my work is a point of liberation. And when we're thinking about what we're liberating, if Muslim mental health, if Islamic psychology wants to create a counter-hegemonic psychology to the way that, as I mentioned before, if psychology, if the side disciplines are normatively in the service of power, then what would it mean to have a liberation, an Islamic sort of liberation psychology, which would be counter-hegemonic, which would go against the norms of what psychology serves. So here it's important that what I've done so far is sort of politicize the disciplines of psychology, right? We know that psychology and the side disciplines are artifacts of Western history, and I often teach on that. So it's sort of trying to understand, well, what does psychology even signify? But we also have to politicize what it means to be Muslim. And here I'm just going to mention very quickly that issues of Islamophobia fall under, in general, follow under sort of these rubrics of liberal racism, these sort of divisions between good Muslims and bad Muslims, right? There are these extremities in society who have this sort of wholesale, this sort of what we call traditional racism, right? This wholesale hatred for Muslims or Islam as groups and categories. But often what we're seeing in terms of Islamophobia belongs to what we call in a post-racial world, these liberal racisms, whereby there's these divides between good Muslim and bad Muslim, or even good migrant, bad migrant. You know, good migrants are those who develop vaccines, bad migrants are those who siphon off society. And there's a very particular role, which I can relate to in an article I published, to which psychology plays a very significant role as a language, as a register, to be able to furnish the sort of divide between good and bad, which will be important when we think about who are Muslims. Now, I think I'm not going to dwell on this for too much, just simply for the sake of time. I only have 20 minutes. But I think here it's just important to understand that we often talk about Muslims as, as a category to which we identify. But here, I think the work of Richard Jenkins, he makes a distinction between group identification and political categorization. So we as Muslims, we're always both necessarily living within a politicized world. So I can identify as Muslim, but I can also be politically categorized as a Muslim, and therefore also politically categorized as a good Muslim or a bad Muslim. And this is really, really quite significant in trying to understand these various trajectories. So I'm skipping this slide as well, and that slide to really get to the meat of this presentation. But just to keep that in mind, that there's these registers by which good Muslims and bad Muslims are constantly being made very salient across the global north. We know, especially right now in France, in Denmark, in Hungary, United States, within increasing nationalist politics. Actually, I'll go back to that slide, whereby there's a point of Islam being positioned as increasingly the other in political discourse, right? But it doesn't do this wholesale demonization of Muslims. France, Macron, for example, in France right now, he's not saying all Muslims are bad. He's trying to delineate between the good Muslims and the bad Muslims, right? And in a way, this is really what's significant, is that Muslims then are essentially through structures of power they're sort of positioned to self-discipline themselves, to put themselves out as ideal French Muslim citizens. Same thing as British citizens, same thing as American citizens. And so this is really, really significant in trying to conceptualize as well sort of our role as Muslim mental health professionals. So I'm going to speak now to sort of these three trajectories which divide between good Muslims and bad Muslims, and how Muslim mental health or Islamic psychology as fields can potentially play and do play very, very significant roles in actually contributing to these very paradigms themselves. And so the first will be neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is often a catch-all term being now sort of thrown around for almost all ills in society. But I'm going to relate to neoliberalism as a particular sort of development of capitalism, which following sort of the history of the 1970s, onwards in Anglo-Saxon countries. So now I'm speaking specifically to the US and to the UK, where we've seen a rise of austerity policies, for example. We've seen huge, huge cutbacks in public spending. Through these cutbacks of public spending, through neoliberal policies, what has increased as a sort of political discourse is the idea of resilience in policy, not necessarily just resilience as a sort of concept, but resilience within policy has been shown to have increased significantly in age of austerity, in ages of sort of public cuts and public spending, because simply when you keep cutting on public spending, there has to be something to fill in those voids, right? So let's say there's a bunch of mental health centers, whatever it might be. Let's say you cut the spending from the mental health centers. Now there's people who obviously might be experiencing distress, whatever it might be. So what has grown in neoliberal climates is that there's this rhetoric of having to be responsible for yourself, take care of yourself, right? Take care of yourself. Therefore, the government no longer has to spend on you. And that's where this point of this concept of resilience has really, really grown, especially in the last 10, 15 years. And it's really significant here, whereby it relates to Muslims on a broader scale. So the way all of the population is sort of being pushed towards developing resilience. And of course, Muslims and Muslim mental health professionals may jump on board with that, and we might have some form of sort of religious literacy, whereby we see, resilience is part of, let's say, Islam, or something that's significant for us as Muslims. But in doing so, we're actually reproducing that very narrative that we're actually that the austerity and all these budget cuts are almost reified in their intent. With that, we've also known that the whole point of like psychology talk has become also very significant. So mental health resilience there is also very important. And I think as it relates to the third point there, which is associated with larger counter-terror apparatus. So there's a really good book called Varieties of Resilience. And it looks at resilience in policies, both in the US and UK. And it finds that it's often also stemming from counterterrorism. And we know that the war on terror is distinctly associated with as sort of a racialized social conflict that's associated with Muslims. And therefore, when we as Muslims were reproducing this resilience discourse, we're actually in a way replicating the war on terror's production of the concept of resilience, that Muslims should not only be resilient to like increasing budget cuts, but also resilient in our mental health towards these flying ideological viruses that might infect us and make us and turn us into terrorists. And that's often how resilience is used in policy discourse. The second paradigm is nationalism. And this is actually, a lot of this was also drawn from my PhD. But I think one thing that's really interesting, if you look at sort of the history of research on identity. Now, identity has a very interesting sort of history, which I can't get into, but you know, there's a very apparent stream of research which shows that among Muslims in the global North, that you know, well-being is intrinsically associated with like a very well integrated national religious identity. So, you know, those who have the best sort of integrated British Muslim identity, you know, they probably have the best sort of experience of well-being, or American religion or American Muslim identity. So, and those who have these conflicts between their identities are those who may experience, you know, illness or, you know, an ill being, so to speak. And so Muslim mental health professionals may very well be positioned in reproducing that narrative. We already know of Muslim mental health professionals, you know, often when it comes to issues, especially here in the UK, of like civic education, you know, mental health professionals might be playing a role in issues of like grievances, of anger towards the country, you know, anger towards foreign policy. You know, we can imagine that anger towards foreign policy would immediately sort of disrupt that sort of national religious identity, right? But now a mental health professional comes in, and instead of sort of talking about the issues which might be disrupting the national sort of religious identity, now they're speaking towards the anger, right? They're talking towards the well-being itself, which I'm going to get to on the next paradigm. So there's this whole stream of social identity theory, which is highly politicized, actually. And Muslim mental health professionals may very well play a role in trying to reify this narrative of sort of well-being being associated with Britishness, with being American, which, as I had written about during my PhD, one of the issues with this very paradigm is that it actually reproduces this perpetual state of psychic conflict. This, what we know ever since 9/11, is that Muslims, there's no way to actually completely prove your Britishness or your Americanness, because that's the whole point of Muslims being othered, you know, through nationalism. So what ends up happening between the good Muslim and bad Muslim is that there's no, you're almost always constantly in this state of having to potentially prove yourself, and you know, which, as I've seen at least among Muslims, creates you know, is a very sort of distressing, suffocating experience. And so what is my role then as a Muslim mental health professional? Am I supposed to just sit there, sort of address the distress that comes from, oh, you know, you know, I'm being othered constantly, you know? So if that person's saying that, am I supposed to just address the distress itself? Or is there something wider here? You know, is it by me addressing that distress exclusively, am I missing sort of the woods for the trees. And so that's just that paradigm. And the one that I've been writing about mostly has been about sort of Muslims playing an increasing role in the security apparatus, especially in the war on terror, and especially in sort of identifying individuals that might become terrorists in the future, which belongs to a very racist sort of pre-criminal industry. Here are two slides, one from the UK, one from the US, which is sort of showing that association, one about sort of potential indicators that might be make someone susceptible to radicalization. And this is sort of the counter-violent extremism training that you go through, and you see mental health, you see loss, family upheaval. And at the bottom, in the US, there was recent sort of funding, a lot of funding being given to hospitals and mental health services to reduce mental health problems and increase the social belongingness among adolescents. So there's this increasing role of mental health professionals in the security industry, and it's growing exponentially. And so there's 4 points here, and then I'll have to end, given I'm at the end of my time. One is that we know that Muslim mental health professionals are increasingly offered roles in CVE, and so there's an element of having to know that sort of political literacy. You know, what are these industries? What's going on? Two, through increasing budget cuts, there's also sort of this rerouting of mental health. So there's funding for mental health, whereas that might have gone previously into the communities themselves, is now being rerouted into issues of security. So now you have to, for the growing sort of mental health industry, you might have to prove a sort of security element to your ability to work publicly. So, and then there's the securitization of mental health practice itself, which is highly problematic. And I think I'll end on a final point. I mean, I think ever since I've been talking and writing about these things for years now, I've been getting a lot of Muslims, patients and clients who've been coming to me, and they say they're coming exclusively to me because they know, because I talk about these things, that they can speak to me about their issues, because they're worried if they go to even another Muslim mental health professional, they're unsure if they can really talk about, let's say, issues of Palestine or things that are important to them. And so I think until now, we've done a lot in terms of sort of, if you see point 1.3, you know, we might be reproducing some of the failures in anti-racism and mental health, which is about sort of cultural competence or ethnic matching, right? That this person's Muslim, I'm Muslim, we're both Muslims, and therefore that's great. But actually, there's an element of sort of this sort of political awareness of what's going on in terms of our issues. And so there's a lot here that I wanted to still talk about, but given that I'm at the end of my time, maybe I can relay back to this slide when it's Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we're gonna wait until the end of the panel to do the Q&A, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next presentation. Okay. Okay, so yeah, Dr. Shamoon, I made you the co-host, as well as Anthony Pennant. So one of you can share your screen. Okay, great. So our next presentation is titled Person of a Therapist, Socially Responsible Therapist, by Dr. Zain Shamoon, who completed his Ph.D. in Human Development and Family Studies in fall 2017 at Michigan State University. He's also a marriage and family therapist, serving clients with a range of presenting problems. In March 2015, he helped launch the Narratives of Pain Project, which is a community storytelling project based in Metro Detroit and now Seattle. Currently, Zain is a professor of couple and family therapy at Antioch University, Seattle. And then also here is Anthony Pennant, who earned his master's degree in marriage and family therapy from Drexel University in 2012, is a licensed marriage and family therapist and approved supervisor through the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. He is currently a Ph.D. student in the Marriage and Family Therapy program at Antioch, New England, and is full-time teaching faculty in the Couple and Family Therapy Department at Antioch University, Seattle. Anthony has extensive experience in working with individuals, couples, and families, including neurodiversity and children. In addition to his work with family, he has served on various nonprofit organizations, including Mnuchin Center for the Family, as well as the Washington Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. At this time, Anthony maintains private practice in Seattle, supporting people of color, blended families, special needs children and their families, as well as the LGBT plus community. Okay, whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Hello, assalamu alaikum everyone. I don't know if Professor Pennant and I are both spotlit now, are we? I don't know,
No, you're not. Maybe we could have you both spotlit.
Yes, please.
Okay.
I think I did it for both.
Okay. All right. Can everyone see us?
Okay, hold on.
It looks like maybe I'm spotlit, but I don't know if you are yet.
I think maybe you can only spotlit one person at a time. Maybe we can just if people can just turn it to speaker view, then that'll work.
Yeah.
But in either case, I guess we can go ahead and start. So like we said, my name is Dr. Zain Shamoon, and Professor Anthony Pennant, both and I work at Antioch University, Seattle. We're going to be talking today about just like a training model that, and to be kind of just direct from the go, comes from a man of color who contributed a lot to the field, but in some synergy to the talk before this, we often have status quo ways that we teach graduate students about mental health and what it means to heal and what it means to train. And one of the ways that the status quo pervades is we tell people, and this is sort of a Western idea, that leave your stuff at the door, leave your humanity at home, because you can't react to your clients, you can't project onto your clients, right? But if we're not careful, what this can do is it can produce really cold, distant, hyper-boundaried therapists that don't know how to use their self or ignore it when something is happening for them while they're in the room, and so they don't know how to manage it. So for a long time in our field, we've had paradigms. A lot of therapists have talked about how do you embrace yourself, the self, as part of your, what's happening for you as a therapist when you're going to the training, so that when something happens, you're able to use it ethically, right? You could sit there, for example, and be like, well, I'm not a racist. I couldn't be racist. I couldn't be prejudiced about anything. And then when it comes up, you're shocked, you deny it, you explain yourself too much, or you over talk about something or under talk about something in the session with your client, which is very different than being like, hey, you know what, maybe I have a gap. Or maybe there's something that I've been socialized in a way that, I could learn more about. If you sit with yourself, even though you may be uncomfortable, but the problem is we don't necessarily orient graduate students this way. We don't necessarily train them this way. And if we do, it's some sort of footnote as part of like a multicultural class, and then we never talk about it again and people have their degrees. So what we're talking about today is an ethical imperative about teaching graduate students a different way. Professor Pennant, is there anything else that you would kind of add to that in terms of how we're introducing our topic?
No, I love the way what you said. I appreciate that. So.
Okay, so we'll go into it. So I'll give the quick overview, and then Professor Pennant, I'll hand it to you. So the training, what is this training? So Dr. Harry Aponte and colleagues, but Dr. Harry Aponte came up with the person of the therapist training, with the idea of when we train people in mental health, that we should train them to know themselves, figure out what's happening for them in the moment, not just like this thing afterwards where it's like, well, probably projected onto my client. There's this idea in mental health that the only thing you need to be worried about in terms of issues of self is like when you project onto your client, right? The client comes in and they have their stuff and they're projecting it onto you, and then you project it back. We often call that countertransference. But I think that when we talk only about countertransference, it's a complete misread from all the matters of self that are happening in session. There are things that happen that we could project on our clients without them first projecting on us. We could have things that are happening in our lives leading up to the session that have nothing to do with the client. We're not just countering back to them. There's stuff that we are doing in our own self-care and our own self-management that impact how we do sessions. So in this training, it's 3, depending on where you're going to school, it's either like 2 or 3 semesters or 3 quarters if you're on the West Coast like us, where you'll have 3 supplemental classes, and graduate students in this field or whoever's training in the person of the therapist model, we spend the first quarter, what's going on for you? What are some themes about you that follow you in different contexts of your life? You know, in your personal relationships, in your professional world, things that come up for you. And then the second quarter, we follow that up with, okay, how do you notice that that theme is coming up for you in the room? Is there something, there's some sort of signaling? Is it a sensory response? And we train about that for an entire course. And at Antioch, we blend that with the multicultural perspectives class when students are learning to embrace and take accountability for their social location. We do that because people want to know that they're woke, and people want to know that they're not prejudiced. So what happens for you if you made a mistake? What happens for you when you misidentified somebody? What happens for you if you got something that a client said wrong? Are you going to be like, no, I couldn't possibly have gotten it wrong. I'm a good person. Or are you going to sit in it? Are you going to sit in it and what's happening to your body? And how are you going to ground it? And then the third quarter is we actually do a simulated lab experience where we bring, if they're in a program where they're actually seeing clients, it may be different, but for ones where they're completing their coursework, and then we'll see their clients later as part of internship, that we bring in an actor. But basically a simulated lab experience where they're noticing what's happening for them and about their themes while they're in the session, and they get direct training about how to use that. So this is a really big shift here. It's not just all the countertransference and the ways that we can project. It's also your humanity, who you are, you can use it. Your client and you do not have a one-to-one correlation of the world, your life experience. However, at the same time, there's something happening in the room for the therapist too. So if it's there, it's not going anywhere. How can you use it artfully? So for a quick example, if I know that I have these worries in my life about like, am I going to lose out on my connections in life? I've had a lot of loss in my life, and oh shoot, like, but I don't want to project it on my client because it's a professional relationship. So it's completely fine if they, you know, they have another therapist. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, but I know that I'm involved in all the relationships that I have in my life, professional, personal, whatever. I'm there, I'm engaging. So I can sit there and throw shade at myself and say like, come on, Zain, be professional. And there is a reason to set those boundaries. However, there's also a reason to embrace my natural sensibility of engagement at that moment. And if I sit with it, I can use it artfully. I can use it in a nuanced way. And the only way you can do that is if you spend time with yourself experientially. And so that's why we commit graduate students to doing this for 3 quarters, because you're going to be sitting with a client where you're weighing the humanity of it, and you're going to be making ethical choices. And the main contention here for our presentation today is you can't make ethical choices about something you avoid. We don't talk about what's happening for you in the session, you can't make ethical choices. The old idea was like, we shouldn't talk about that, we shouldn't address it because that stuff, that's not, we have to draw a hard boundary. But you know what? Let's look at the liability about that. Liability issues are not prevented from people ignoring issues they could be liable about. So we talk about, you know, what's going on for you in the room, and making sure that we embrace our humanity. We do it for 3 quarters.
Thank you for saying that, Dr. Shamoon. So what is the relevance of POT to mental health practitioners and collaborators? It's very, very apparent that there's social movement around being accountable to people of color and all religions, all faiths and movements. And really POT, as Dr. Shamoon has stated, is really about how do we as individuals make sure, and help mental health practitioners, how do we make sure that we can provide the best care, right, to those who are coming into our doors. And some of that has to do with implicit bias, the things that they think about, right, that get challenged based on how we talk to our clients and patients. And a big thing that I really enjoy about this personal therapist training and why we are pushing this forward specifically with mental health practitioners, and even when we collaborate with medical doctors, psychiatrists, or nurse practitioners, is because the way that this system of care that people interact with is unfortunately built on Western ideals, right? And so being able to go in, what are your symptoms? You don't look at the person, you don't understand, you don't connect with the empathy of what might be happening for that person, these emotions that might be happening for the individual or family or couple. And if you ignore that, right, then that has an impact on their ability to adhere to some of what we want them to be able to do, whether that be medication management, whether that be coming to therapy, whether that be trusting in the therapeutic process, right, and making sure that we understand what their needs are and believe them. It's something Dr. Shamoon says all the time to the students, and I really appreciate that. We want to make sure that when people come into us and see us, that we can believe them. We don't want them to think that we are dismissing any parts of them. And if we don't, or if we are unable to be accountable to ourselves and how we show up with some of our clients and families and patients, then they can feel that. And I think that in this day and age, it's a really huge thing. Dr. Shamoon, you can go to the next slide. So what does this have to do with ethics? I think ethics, I'll start off by saying this, is that ethics is something that usually is always a footnote. It's always at the end of something. It's a specialized class that we all have in our master's programs, right, or doctoral programs, where we have to learn about the rules to keep people safe. But I think that if we broaden this, it's not just keeping people safe. I think it's also keeping ourselves safe. It's keeping our profession safe. And it's something that is imbued in everything that we do. And so what we want to do is we want to widen this thought, this scope of what ethics look like, and specifically in the person of the therapist framework, where we are arguing for three things. The first thing is that the value of real-time self-attunement and maintaining an ethical stance as a therapist. There is value in being able to understand and know what's happening for us in the particular moment. And having some congruency around, I have this feeling, and what does that feeling mean? And being able to express that, or use that, or act on that, or manage it in the particular encounter that you're having with your client. The second one is using professional boundaries with self-attunement in real time. Many times we may actually vibe, right, with our clients. We may really enjoy and lean into that, but some of that, right, some of that comes from wanting to advocate for our clients. I know specifically for me, when I see people of color, I really want to lean in and appreciate and let them know that it is a safe space, and they seek us out because of that. They seek me out because of that. But the other part is that there has to be a boundary between some of my excitement and advocacy with what their needs are, right? And so being able to display that, right, is an ethical way of being able to produce a safe environment for therapeutic interventions. And the last one is wounded healers are responsible healers. I can't say this enough, but I think that when we accept our humanity, I think that's a huge thing. When we think about what healers look like through indigenous health and non-Western views, the person that was the healer, whether that was the doctor, the medicine man, whatever it might have been at that particular moment, there was a humanity to them that was very present. And I think we have to get back to that. When people see that we are human, it is easier for us to connect. When they see that we have wounds too, it is easier for us to connect. It's easier for them to connect. But when we build this wall of being these people that, these healers or these practitioners that choose not to be vulnerable in a particular way, our clients will mimic that same thing. And it breeds almost like a level of distrust. Because we can say this is what you might need, but then they wouldn't understand that, they wouldn't be able to internalize, right? That, oh, well, they're operating in a way that shows vulnerability. Why would I do the same thing? So it's got a cascading effect if we do not show our vulnerability, our openness in session. And I think it is an ethical imperative, because even more so, our society is moving, it's being challenged to not be this buttoned up, suited up individual that you come and tell me everything and then I don't reveal anything of who I am and I cannot be empathetic with you. People are starting to demand, right, a different way to connect in the therapeutic and medical way. Dr. Shamoon.
Yeah, I mean, that leads into this like idea of like, what does it have to do with, you know, the Muslim community? So if we're interested in, you know, and I think, you know, can everyone hear me okay? Good. I just want to make sure my mic is still working so it messes up. You know, I think like we have this ideas of you know, I really appreciated the talk prior to this one in this panel, because there is this issue of like, you know, as much as we're working to break stigmas and, you know, get people to talk about their emotional healing, their relationships, you know, healing and everything, you know, things like mental health have been colonized, you know, and been used to really just, you know, send other messages that are not about healing. And like, for example, in the West, we have these really weird ideas that like, if you're not going to project your bias, it means you have to be stoic. Like for the Star Wars fans out there, literally they tell Darth Vader, don't think about your mom, don't think about the loss. How did that turn out? Didn't turn out great, right? So, you know, the idea of like embracing what's going on for us so that we can be ethical about it. And this is something that a lot of, you know, family therapists, systemic therapists, they knew and actually challenged the field in the mid 20th century to do more connecting about. And it's not just family therapists, but like if we think in general, people like Salvador Minuchin, Virginia Satir, Carl Whitaker, they all believed in this idea of the here and now. What's happening right now in the moment that we can work on it. Could you imagine if you went to go see a physical therapist and the physical therapist is like, I can see the tension point, it's happening right here, but let's just write about it and talk about it and like don't actually press upon the place itself. There are things that are happening in the room, in the moment that they require finesse by the therapist to kind of lean in towards it and use it as necessary. And then you're part of that. You know, and I also want to say that like being ethical is not just like this robot speak of like a bunch of words and you know a bunch of jargon. Just so you know, a lot of times, I don't care if it's a conservative or progressive, but a lot of times the communities people say they're advocating for don't speak the way that we learn to speak in the status quo like world. And we sit there and we go and try to help these communities. We're talking down at them because it's inauthentic. It's completely inauthentic. And graduate schools don't always help us become more authentic because we're sitting there thinking about our competency. We're scared to talk about our woundedness. There are power dynamics. And like, if I do open up, is my professor going to use that to evaluate me? This is a complete set of confidential, like, it's a confidential paradigm where only the students within it are like there. It's part of a vessel. And so what does that have to do with a Muslim population, Islamic tradition? Because a lot of the diasporas that reflect Muslim communities across the world have embraced things like storytelling and sitting with each other and being honest about what's happening for us. We have the concept of like, you know, what's going on with my nafs, right? Like all these things. These are things that are part of our community. And so we want some healing. Our community is not giving it to us necessarily all the time, depending on the power structures there or how we've internalized ways that we need to be talking about our emotions. We see it as like, oh, like if I talk about my stuff, I'm somehow being like, you know, on one end it's gossip, on the other end it's like never talk about your feelings ever, you know, and these are extremes. And so how do you ethically address what's happening for you then? What if somebody is wounded in your family emotionally or yourself? Where are you gonna go? And so reclaiming when we did that well or where we do that well. Because right now it's being filtered by all these sensibilities that are not of us. And so it's being able to reclaim those traditions, right? So counteracting bias that way, honoring, and also there's variance as well. So going back to the whole, like, what are some extremes that can happen if you're not thinking about yourself? Well, I could be a therapist and I would like want to look really woke and I'm working with a Muslim client. So like, how do I signal that? Let me say all the things. Or I could be like, I don't want to make a mistake. So I don't talk about stuff that's about the client's identity at all, because I don't want to make a mistake about it. Neither of those things have to do with the client's needs. Those are completely internal dialogues that are happening from the therapist. So if the therapist doesn't take ownership of that, where that comes from, what they can do to maybe manage it differently, practicing managing it differently, taking ethical risks, asking good questions, leaning into the moment, then they're going to miss out on being able to serve that Muslim client who has their own constellation of identities that they're coming into the room with, their own lived experiences. That person's coming in authentically, and they deserve to have a person who cares, that's in front of them, that's a human being. You can be, you know, send them like the airwaves, like you can be a human being and be professional at the same time. The idea that your humanity is on one extreme and your professionalism is this like buttoned up stoic thing on the other side. I mean, these come from all sorts of colonial, hypermasculine, rigid ideas about how to be a professional. It's this weird thing to like tell people you're going to sit there and help them heal and be like, all right, and I'll see you next week. And okay, like there's some reasons for that, but are you going to pair that with some humanity also and some juice in the session? So honoring lived experiences in an authentic way and reclaiming our traditions. Dr. Pennant?
Therapist positionality and social accountability. Dr. Shamoon, I really like what you were saying though about counteracting bias. I think that is an important thing because that pulls into the position that we as therapists take when we're in this training, right? And being accountable. I think number one is that, you know, there's inherently as a therapist, there's power and authority because we do enter into people's lives, right? And they grant us permission to walk with them and to talk with them around some of the things that are happening and ways that we need to connect, or they want us to connect with them, right? Around being able to have a safe space to have some healing. And so it's a wonderful thing to be able to do and be aware about that, but to understand that we have that responsibility when we're in the room to do that, we have to make sure that we are accountable to them too, right? It's an ethical imperative. Again, it comes back to that. And I think that when we're talking about accountability is that, like, you know, at least I'll talk about it for me in this particular way. Sometimes when I see families that perhaps are people of color or, it's one of those things where you want to advocate for them and you want to call out, like you were saying, the pressure point in the particular moment. And I think that you have we're saying you have a responsibility to do that too, right? Where if they're talking about racism or if they're talking about Islamophobia, I can't pretend that it's not really happening and like, oh, it's not happening in the room. No, it is happening in the room and I need to be able to call it out for what it is, right? Because that is my responsibility. And I think that if we can get our therapists to feel more comfortable in being able to be accountable for the position of being responsible for our clients in that particular way, that does provide some really authentic healing because, again, people are believed. They're believed about what their experiences are, and that's one less place that they have to be questioned. And I think that also, I like the last presenter that was talking about resilience. I think that resilience in that particular way too has been used to hijack, well, you should be able to do this yourself. But, you know, having one less place where you're not resilient in that particular way, right, provides so much ease and healing for individuals to actually free up and figure out what parts of their identity that they want to be able to work on and that they don't have to explain to someone who, you know, isn't going to make them explain to certain things. I think that's good for me, Dr.
Yeah, I think, like, you know, and to that point, what's really inspiring me about what you're saying, Professor Pennant, is that it's like it's not this binary where you're like wounded on one side or you're like this really great professional on the other side. That people who are human, you know, make really good therapists, right? That in our humanity, we do that, and we sometimes can send messages to our clients that have to be one or the other if we're not careful. And one of the ways that we can counteract that is by making sure that in our programs, we actively train about this. I think there are probably enough programs that have diversity and inclusion statements. There's a joke that says, how do you want to say all lives matter from a graduate, like a school standpoint, just, you know, diversity and inclusion statement. It's like just words, it's just jargon. And we sometimes do that to our students. Be ethical, here's the class, you know, take the one class on diversity. But we almost fundamentally make it some like side pimple topic. It's not core to how we look at healing, but people's lived experiences need to be honored as a central point to our training. How do you help people do that? You just tell them, be ethical? Our contention is no, you have to have them know what that looks like. And you can only do that if you experientially sit in it, you know? I have a really good friend that says to me, like, you know, Zain, I can't, I should say his name, Saqib, my friend Saqib. He said to me that, you know, I could tell you all about an orange. I could tell you about its weight, its mass, how many dots are on it. I could tell you its color. I can tell you its hue compared to other types of oranges, all this kind of stuff. But you don't know an orange until you taste it, right? So I could tell you about being ethical. I could give you a bunch of pamphlets. I could give you the handbook on ethics. I could do all these things. But everybody has unique things that trigger them and make them responsive. We have all sorts of things, you know, like you might be like, okay, I feel good today. And then something happens in the middle of the session that reminds you of your own woundedness. And maybe you forgot about that thing. And you're stymied and you're sitting with it and you're in here, which is fine because you're human. But how do you then return back to your client? How do you know how to do that? You could be like, I know I have to center my client right now, but that also comes with practice. It comes with practice, and it comes with like ownership of, okay, this thing is happening, and also being able to recognize that that's happening to you. Not everyone can recognize it. So we have advancing, you know, we're a couple of family therapists, but I think mental health in general has to do with an ownership of training actively in the moment. These can't just be concepts. You know, diversity can't just be a concept. And it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. We as a society are egregious. We are notorious for making these things banners and not actual conversations, not actual commitments where we're sitting with each other. And that stops the work. It stops the work because, you know what? A banner can be seasonal. It can live and die. It's not popular next year. Who cares? Right? Well, now for us, this is like a commitment. It's an ongoing commitment of embracing our humanity, experientially training. So by the time you get and you're sitting with a client, these are things you've experientially, it's a workout that you've done. And so for our contention is we will produce ethical therapists by helping them sit in this type of training for, you know, in the beginning of their graduate programs. And for us at Antioch, we do the family of origin class, multi-generational viewing using a genogram, helping individuals understand their own healing in the context of their family patterns and things like that. We do the insight class with that. We do our multicultural perspective class, sometimes called diversity class, like in other programs, or social justice class for counseling. We do the access to self part in that class. And then we have a third class that's about like counseling skills and therapy skills and basic counseling that we kind of meld with what's happening for you in the room and how can you use that to your advantage and set good boundaries at the same time. So that's our contention about how we advance.
And some clinical implications, developing attuned providers. Dr. Shamoon, I thank you for all that you said around that. I wanted to jump in a couple of times, but I get a chance to do that now. But, you know, no, it's all good. Part of, you know, just really quickly, part of being able to use this is that we have individuals that will go on the training, and the biggest part that makes me very excited is that they are practicing in a very different way. It is more client-centered, yes, and at the same time, it concentrates on the relationship between the therapist and the client, right? That really says, like, how can we use some of this empathy? How can we have this connection? How can we make sure that the relationship between the individuals in the room is really what's powering some of the change that's happening? I mean, everyone talks about some of these like common factors around like what causes people to change and to adhere to treatment and all these things. And of course it's the relationship, but really it is the relationship, right? It's one of the things that, again, people want to be believed. People do not want to be shamed when they're coming into a particular room to receive services, right? And so if we can have that there, that's a big part. And I think furthermore, we're thinking about developing attuned providers, right? I think what would it look like too? We have developing attuned policymakers or policies, right, that go about the relationship, and it isn't just about X amount of dollars that is given to mental health, but it's X amount of dollars that are given to mental health or graduate schools or training programs, right, that are focusing on how providers show up in the room. Right here in Washington State, there is a current bill that's in our legislative body that is working about how do every provider, medical, nurse, you know, behavioral health, how do we make sure that they are ready to deal with individuals of all shapes and size, all religions, right? And so part of this is, I think, right, the personal therapist training, right, to make it more personal. I'm not going to remove the fact that when we go to graduate school, there is technical knowledge that we all have to navigate, right? I think that's part of the program. However, there's humanity that has to be brought into the application of said technical knowledge. And so, you know, being able, this to me, this framework is a really good door to open, to lay out. And so I'll leave it there because we are past time. I do apologize about that. So.
Thank you all so much. We'll catch you all on the question and answer, but I appreciate you all listening to us as we advocate for this. And thank you, Professor Pennant, for sharing space with me as always.
Thank you for that. I just removed the spotlight. Okay. I removed it, right? It's okay. Sorry. Okay, so our next presentation is from Mohammed Zeshan. Do you have your PowerPoint, or would you like me to present it?
I have my PowerPoint. Thank
Okay.
you. Let me just share.
So I believe I made you co-host. So
Yes.
So you can go ahead and share if you'd like. Okay. Mohammed Zeshan is a psychiatrist and assistant professor of psychiatry at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, and Dr. Zeshan is an international medical graduate from Pakistan. This presentation is titled Transgender Mental Health Initiatives in Pakistan, and you can go ahead and get started whenever you like.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry for joining a bit late. So I'm Mohammed Zeshan, and thank you for inviting me. I know it's a very different and sensitive topic, especially on the transgender mental health. So today I would like to focus, how I got interested in this topic, what I have done so far, and what my future direction, especially my work in Pakistan. So I'm assistant professor here at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. I completed my child psychiatry fellowship from Harvard Boston Children's Hospital, and also did 2-year infant parent mental health fellowship from UMass Boston. So why, this topic? Because that's the question being asked for me for many times. So I came to US in 2013, started my residency in 2014 at a Bronx Care Hospital in New York. And during my first year, I had a patient, a 23-year-old who was bisexual, identified as male, and who was admitted. And when he was assigned to me, and when I was reviewing his case, I have seen that he was getting, a lot of time getting into arguments, which is requiring physically restraining him, giving him IM intramuscular medications. And that has been happening almost every day when I used to come in the morning for the morning round. So one day after I finished my work, I just, wanted to know what has been happening. So I just sat down with him, asked, what has been going on. And, after hesitancy, he opened up to me that, one thing that was very unique, which I found, and again, I was new to US system, the uniqueness was there were so many tattoos, I believe close to 60 or 70 tattoos, on his face, on his body. And there are so many piercing. Again, I believe it was 34 piercing, mostly on his face, but also other parts of the body. And I was asking him, why, what has been so difficult for you? Why, you have been getting into arguments every day? And he said, because the way, so he was, as I said, that he was identified as male, but he used to dress as a female, and he used to have a makeup on it, lipstick, and nail polish. And he mentioned, the people in the unit, they commented on him, and that triggered him, and that's why he was getting angry and irritable. And then when I asked him, what it means to you, wearing this makeup, wearing this nail polish, and then he shared his story. So his story was that, so his mother, he was basically an unwanted pregnancy. Mother, had a boyfriend. They got pregnant. Mother wanted to pursue her career, but so when she got pregnant, she didn't want to continue the pregnancy. But mom's parents, they supported her, and they said, they will take care of that baby, and she can pursue her career. So the moment he was born, he was taken care of by maternal grandparents, and mom went to pursue her career. And when he was around 10-year-old, mother came back to New York. She was out of the state for most of the 10 years. So when she came back, he wanted to live with his mother. So at age 10, he started living with his mother, who had a boyfriend. And at age 13, there was a New Year Eve, and mother had I think there was some question about what was the reason. Either there was a severe respiratory attack or mother overdose. So mother died in his hand while he was on a call with 911, because there was so much rush on the traffic, and they used to live in Manhattan. So she died in his hand. And after that event, he basically took mother's role. He started wearing mom's dress. He started acting, the way the mom used to do makeup. He also started living with, he tried to live with mom's boyfriend. And then, he was rejected by his own family. He was rejected by the community, and that put him, in the street. He became homeless, got into drugs. And then he has been hospitalized so many times. And he was mentioning, these tattoos, this remind me about that event related to mom. This piercing remind me about my mom. And whenever I do another piercing, whenever, the more pain I get, it remind me the pain it remind me the pain that I had on that day when my mom died in my hand. So that was the first time where I learned about, learned more about gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender expression. And I thought, I'm a first year psychiatry resident, and and I felt very inadequate because I didn't know much about those terminology. So I went to my training director. I asked her, I feel very embarrassed. I don't know. I mean, this is a really painful story. I really want to help my patient, but I don't even know, how to talk, how to be more mindful, what language, what pronoun, what to use. So she said, you may not be alone. And she asked me to design a survey and do in the residency program, like how many residents they know about, basic terms and definition. So I designed the survey where, I asked them, what is the definition of lesbian, gay, bisexual, different definition that I asked. And then I also asked, what are different LGBT welcoming signs. And based on the survey, I think, so this is the survey results. So hardly, I think, I found that like 1/3 of them were able to, define what is the sexual orientation, gender identity, what are common challenges faced by, the LGBTQ community. So that was an eye-opener in general that, I was training in New York, where, the theme was there are so many people who are part of the LGBT community, but in a program within the city, the residents or the hospital, there were only few, like 1/3, they were aware of basic terms and definition and the common health challenges. And what are the common confusion was, what is sexual orientation, what is gender identity? People were confusing between orientation and identity, between expression and sex. So I will, so that was my interest. That's how I got interested in this subject. So for that patient, I learned about, different terms. I learned how to talk, how to be mindful. And then I talked to his grandparents. And finally, the disposition was that the grandparents agreed to take him home. And then after that, we saw significant decrease in inpatient hospitalization. So I saw, in my own, this just curiosity to learn or explore something that I was unaware of, and this need that being a physician, being a psychiatrist in United States, I may have more patients down the road. So how I can talk to them without being more open, being non-judgmental, being more compassionate. So that's how I got involved in so many organizations and then I designed some guideline for my program and presented, and I have been presenting this nationally at American Psychiatric Association conference for the past 3-4 years. And then I think 2 years ago, someone asked me the second question. So okay, you got that patient, and you got interested in that, but what is just keep you going and keep you more interested about this topic? And then at that point, I try to reflect, is there anything else, that is making me very passionate about this topic? And then one thing that came into my mind. So I grew up in a small town in Pakistan, and I remember the house where I grew up and I was born. So the next house is the community center of the transgender. And when that person asked the question and I reflected back, I had those vivid memories, how this the transgender community, they used to come to our house, they used to share, no matter either we are grieving, we are happy, or anything that is happening to our house, they used to come very open-ended, and very curious and helpful. Listen to what has been happening and make us feel, that there is someone who doesn't, who don't have any blood relationship, but they are, very empathic and genuinely interested. And then I realized maybe, those early memories in my mind might have, and I saw some opportunities in the United States after almost, I would say 30 years. So when I saw that opportunity, so it just, excited me to help that community. So when I completed my training in New York, went to Harvard at Boston Children's Hospital, and then when I made that connection that maybe, there is something very early in my life that happened that may have, make me interested in that topic. So I went back to Pakistan. I met, met a couple of NGOs who were working in the, the transgender community. And the support group that I found was the Huat Foundation. So when I met them, I heard, so when I met them, so this is, where I am at a center in a Huat Foundation Center. This is in the Fountain House in Lahore. So I met with them, I heard their story, and the stories are so powerful. They were mentioning, some of them were mentioning that, they had to leave their house at 9-10 years of age because the parents, they stopped accepting them, and they had to travel miles away to make sure no one recognized them. And they had to travel by their own at 9-10 years of age and went through so many difficulties. And then they settled, with some community center, and then they got their gurus who have been helping and who have been mentoring them. And then a couple of years ago, when Pakistan, had this third gender on the passport, and when they asked, who is, their guardian or who's their parent, and many times, the guru who was the main person who was their guardian. So the parents, they just, rejected them. So there are some programs, this Huat Foundation is one that is helping, the transgender community more a little on the financial aspect. So I spoke with them, and we are, about to start a pilot program in collaboration with the Huat Foundation, where we are trying to definitely gather some data about the prevalence of depression, anxiety, sexually transmitted diseases, and what are the other mental health challenges that, this community might be facing, and with the hope that after getting those need assessment, we will be able to do some training to the mental health counselor who are working with the Huat Foundation. So just a little bit structure of the Huat Foundation. So this is, as I said, this is a NGO. They provide a lot of loans. They provide a lot of training, vocational training, and some literacy, how to make them independent, how to make a transgender community very independent. This is different way they registered, and they have, I think, more than 1,000, I think, all over Pakistan, the transgender who are registered under them. And at the end, and I will be happy to answer questions further, but I just wanted to give a broader overview and some guidelines that are available. So these are some guidelines that are, available for people who want to learn more. So Joint Commission has guideline, and the Fenway Institute in Boston, they have, they have a website. They have a lot of videos and how to make the environment LGBT friendly, how to talk to people, what are the common challenges. And same thing with the New York City Department. And these are a couple of other associations that have some guidelines. These are some websites that could be helpful for people who want to learn more about it. There are some organizations, especially World Association of Transgender Health, WPATH. They have, a lot of resources for developing countries and globally what has been going on internationally on transgender mental health. These are some books that are available. These are some professional guidelines by American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, by American Psychiatric Association, by American Psychological Association, by World Psychiatric Association of Transgender Health, and Endocrine Society. And these are, some books I think I really love, from Dr. Eric Jarbo, Dr. Lavonos, Dr. Pleak. I work with them very closely. So these are some resources to learn more. So why, again, my story started from one of my patients. It went into, making a project for my program, presenting nationally, and then transitioning into Pakistan. So why we, sometimes this question comes, why I need to learn about, this topic. I feel, it's just main reason for, having, and I was very excited, when I was invited to present this topic, because this is just to make sure, that when we are talking, who don't judge people the way they look, the way they appear, the way they talk, the way they wear, or what they wear. So goal is to just be more professional, be more respectful, and be more compassionate and be more human. Thank you.
Shall I just jump in, Nayala?
Yeah, go ahead.
Wonderful. Well, I will keep my comments very, very brief. My name is Chantal, and I'm an anthropologist here at MSU, and I have a very, very much interested in gender studies and have done work with teenagers in France of Algerian descent and looking at their peer practices of communication. So my interest is a bit tangential, but I think these papers just work so well together. And what I really see in these papers is a kind of path forward, right? We have Dr. Younis, who has theorized for us in really brilliant terms the problems, the kind of colonial context, right, for the encounter, the mental health and health encounter that we need to overcome as practitioners and as clients. And in the first paper, we really have this, the groundwork is laid out for us to attempt to kind of transcend through anti-racist and anti-colonial reimagining, right, of what mental health is and how to practice it, how to combat sort of neoliberal, changes to the system. So there's this wonderful kind of laying out of a theoretical framework for the incredible work then that Professor Shamoon, Professor Pennant, and then Professor Zeshan are actually engaging with. So there's a kind of theoretical piece. I saw the paper of Professor Shamoon and Pennant to really lay out a practice, right, for overcoming, for transcending a kind of colonial model for therapy. So the POT, right, the person of the therapy is then a kind of practice that is in line with an anti-colonial theorization of psychology and of mental health. And finally, we have Professor Zeshan, who is embodying the person of the therapy, right? He is actually he has, instead of shrinking or being fearful, right, of his lack of knowledge or his lack of understanding, he engaged in research, right, and found that other therapists like himself were feeling fear, ignorance, a lack of understanding of the complex gender and sexual orientations of their therapists, and has since, created a vibrant practice around being an ally with his LGBTQ plus A+ clients. So I really feel that these papers, sort of give us a telescoping understanding, right, of in some ways, the immensity of the problems that we are overcoming, all of us are overcoming as theorists, researchers, practitioners, in grappling with, the post-colonial and neo-colonial aspects of working within a social science and therapeutic context that is at least implicitly racist and colonialist, but sometimes explicitly, right? And trying to overcome that. And I think that we have a path forward with the POT model for therapy, and then also the almost the sort of embodiment of the method, right, in Professor Zeshan. So I'm really going to stop there because I think that you will, the presenters will probably want to speak to each other, and then we'll have probably plenty of questions to also to ask and to continue the conversation. But I just felt very, very much the papers really speak to each other, and that they give us a kind of, statement of the problem, and also a kind of path forward to try to transcend the colonialist and racist kind of legacy that we're dealing with, all of us. I'll stop there, but I guess I need to, do I need to change the view, or is that something you'll, okay. So it would be great to have the panelists sort of speak to each other's work as well, perhaps.
I think I really like this concept, that Dr. Shamoon mentioned, to be in present, because a lot of time, and as I said, I'm a child psychiatrist, but also an infant and parent psychiatrist. I'm currently doing a fellowship in toddler psychiatry, especially in parenting. There is so many time, whenever parents, they just always either back what happened to them in the past, or they are so worried that they want to think about how this current behavior can affect the future. And I can give and a funny example that one time happened is, sometimes we ask parents to spend time with their child, the toddler, and the baby is playing with the blocks, red block, and then instead of father or mother playing with the child, they start playing their own, because they said they never, oh my goodness, who never had this experience, and let me enjoy. So I think just and the other thing on the same line I have seen is that, for example, a child is misbehaving and parents knew that this misbehavior have triggered my trauma or anxiety or anger in the past. Then instead of being present on the time, they try to distract themselves by either playing on their phone, or either watching TV, or either moving away. So, and so one thing, what have been really helpful for me to helping parents to stay in the moment is this research, which is showing that, in an average parenting, 70% of the time you spend in making mistake and repairing it. And the other thing that, and again, sorry, I'm talking a lot in parenting context because that work I do. And the other, I feel it's a misconception between a quality of time and quantity of time. Because a lot of time we want to be more focused, so much focus on the quality time, and we want to make sure, when things are going okay, we spend my time. But I feel, as long as you are just learn how to be there, as much as time you can spend, quality just come automatically. So I really like that point of being present in that moment, not worrying about what happened to me, not worrying, oh my goodness, this child misbehaving so much, he will never get a a good career or those things. So I really like that point. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe we could ask Professors Pennant and Shamoon to talk a little bit about repair, right? Or sort of that iterative understanding of the therapeutic, kind of encounter of being, present, but also able to, sort of make mistakes and then repair, right? I suppose that is probably integral to the POT model, right?
Yeah, I mean, I will let Mr. Pennant speak on that as well. I just want to say, you know, just as we're sharing about like all the presentations, I was just inspired by everyone here. I mean, the shorthand is sticking it to the man, but the long form is, you know, if we acquiesce to the status quo, right? There's this idea of like there's this, I forget if it's I think it's Tatum who says that you know, if you're trying to oppose something, you can't just sit on the conveyor belt, because if you sit on it and you're neutral towards it, it actually continues to move forward. Beverly Tatum. So like, if it continues to move forward. So if we have oppressive forces that make it so that we learn therapy in a certain way for certain populations, certain access, therapy costs this much money, this is when we do it, this is how we train people, this is the populations that we're concerned about really. And even as we serve other populations, they're seen as others. And so the centrality is still, so everyone today kind of just had that, you know, in order for us to really make change, we have to perturb. We have to perturb the status quo. We have to actively walk against the conveyor belt. You can't just sit on it. If you sit on it, then the status quo continues. I was just inspired because I felt like all the presentations had that, and that kind of gave us, I think, in our presentation, the gall to kind of go with that flavor as well. But with respect to the idea of repair is part of relationships. It just is. And I think in therapy, we have an opportunity to help people know that they have a strong alliance with their other human being that sees them endure past the point of repair. We tell students all the time, and it always comes up in the second quarter. It always comes up in the second quarter because we talk about race, and we talk about race directly. And students like want to know that they're good people. Professors want to know that they're good people. And then all sorts of things, like people are talking about different, like people use different language and they get in tiffs and triangulations and all this kind of stuff. And our main contention is, how will you all as a cohort catch yourselves on the other side in a couple of weeks from now when you're sitting back in class with each other? Because you're going to have to do this with your clients. The other idea, right, the false idea is that you're never going to have an uncomfortable moment with your clients. Well, why'd you become a therapist then? I'm not trying to throw shade, but like you're sitting in the mess of it on purpose because you're helping people untangle the mess. You have to be in the middle of it. So I think that endurance is part of the therapeutic alliance. I'm always inspired by folks who write in comment factors who talk about the therapeutic alliance, and they talk alongside that very directly. Rupture is part of it. Rupture is part of it, and that repair is part of it. And we don't often have, in our polarized worlds, we don't always have an opportunity to witness and observe that repair. So it can be quite healing just to focus on that. It doesn't matter what theory you're using, it just helps people like connect on that level. And that's why that's so related to outcomes, I think. Professor Penn, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I will say really quickly that number one, I really appreciated Dr. Zeshan, your content of what you were talking about in topic. I thought it was just very timely, and it does blend well in all of the things that we all talked about today. But one thing that reminds me a little bit around repair is that if, you know, I've had some children who are transgender come into the office and they talk a little bit about that. And what you see is that there's this rupture that happens between the parents and the child, right? In regards to the navigating of their sexuality and gender. Two separate things, but still. And some of that is like sitting with them and teaching them, right, how to repair, right? And it's okay to have a thought and a vision of what you thought your life or the child's life was going to be. And the child has that same grief and loss too. And how do you bring these people together? And if you're not willing to want to sit in some of that discomfort, right, that's kind of happening and feel that and go, I understand what that must be like for you, right? Or I can empathize with that's like for you, right? And the same thing for the child, and bring them together. Now, this is how you talk. I think some of that is that we have to do that in therapy in order to move families along. But quickly, the other part is that like in society, at least Western society, we focus really on like physical things and not the emotional, tangible like connections that we have, right? And so it's about money and possessions and things like that. We forget about how to connect with people. And I think that repair is a huge thing about returning back to this level of spirituality around we are connected individuals. We are connected to our families and our friends and everyone. We're connected. And I think that's the biggest part that I really love about repair.
Yeah, and it would be really wonderful to get Professor Younis to talk about repairing the system, because of course we have these a possibility for repair, right, and growth, and including ourselves in our therapy or our research as practitioners, but we also have to repair the system, right? And the system is, in some ways broken or needs maybe different kinds of repair. Dr. Zeshan was working with NGOs, right? But we still have this structural problem around funding structures and the ways that, mental health is being conceived of in this neoliberal moment. So I think maybe could you speak a little bit to, and you also talked about the therapeutic encounter, Dr. Younis, in terms of, establishing trust and creating a kind of safe space, right, for people's experiences to be validated, right, beyond, sort of anti-Islamic, rhetoric and fears of politicization for your identity. So maybe could you speak a little bit, Dr. Younis, to, sort of bringing this notion of repair to not just the kind of therapeutic encounter, but to, the colonialist structures that we're trying to dismantle? It's, I'm asking you to solve the problem that you laid out, which is not fair of me, but it maybe to just have our conversation kind of telescope between the types of repair we need to engage in.
Yeah, well, that is definitely a big question. But first of all, I definitely appreciate all the co-presenters. I think one person who sort of ties in, I think, all the themes that were sort of co-presented right now is Ian Parker. It's funny because I think there's a sort of growing recognition that psychologists and the side disciplines inherently are the purveyors of the status quo, right? And there's something about the maintenance of what ideal subjectivity is, right? What's the ideal sort of thoughts and behaviors of citizenry was maintained through the side disciplines. And Ian Parker talks about that, especially when we think about sort of the ideal model of citizen being sort of a heteronormative, white middle class individual, and everyone is sort of pivoting around that, and that's sort of where pathology is to be found. I guess I never really thought about it in terms of repair, because I was sort of thinking while this discussion was happening, because I think we're not even really at the level of resistance yet. And I think there's a point whereby I think resistance is itself the form of repair that I think many people need. We speak to individuals who sort of are impacted by the war on drugs, the war on gangs, the war on terror. There's an element whereby the resistance is itself the repair. I think there's a point whereby there's this mutual recognition. We see that you're being hurt by the system, right? By these hierarchies of power. And, it's just the point of validation, which is inherently so important, just to be able to see other people, recognize that we're all in this together in the state of resistance. There's an organization here, NGO in London called Healing Justice London, and they do a really great job on that. And they really center this fact that, this isn't about therapist, client, we're all in this together. We're all, you come and you're part of this, you're part of a community, which brings us back that sort of Islamic ethics that we have this amana, we have this responsibility for sight, right? And I think especially within Islam, there's this point of always perpetually testifying to others. We're always constantly seeing each other. We're responsible for those whom we see, and that's what ties us together. So yeah, I think resistance is itself repair. If the system itself can be repaired, I think that's definitely a bigger question. To be a little bit cynical, I think things are going pretty bad, in my opinion. And I think for us to first recognize that, understand, and sort of develop that political literacy, even among us as Muslim health professionals. What is happening with the system? What's happening to the mental health system? And maybe just to finalize, I think maybe just to speak to Zain and Anthony's really great presentation as well. You know, I think there was a point whereby maybe I had, I guess, a question to them, you know, about this point of presence and this authenticity. But one thing that I found was really interesting in my own research was just how much our own presence in our spaces is so itself restricted and limited by our environment, right? And this is something that's increasingly very visible here in the UK. Mental health services are being cut down. They're highly centralized here in the UK, especially. I know in the US it's not centralized, but you know, policies like war on drugs policies, war on terror policies. So all these things are in the therapist's mind constantly, right? That they have to be following all these various directives. So there's one thing that I think tell therapists, well, you need to be more authentic, you need to be more present. But there's also another thing to recognize, why are people feeling suffocated? And if you look at the walls around them, you see that there's this constraint, right? And that's why I feel like I'm always a little bit, I guess, I say with a little bit of trepidation to ask people to be more authentic, because in a way, yes, I absolutely agree with everything you said, but at the same time, I can recognize your sense of suffocation. If you have a sense of suffocation, if you feel like, oh, I have to think about so many things when I see a Muslim, like one case, a Muslim woman put on a niqab, and you know, the therapist told her that one of the signs of successful treatment will be your ability to take it off again. And so, you know, and this operates within the war on terror logic. So I would just open that up with your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that. I think we make a distinction that when we talk about people's authenticity, one, it's the onus of the therapist, not the client, number one, to be authentic, to hold that space, because the client's going to have varying needs. But also, the authenticity is not about having some sort of like some like, you know, random like, you know, like hamster, like science, like experiment where it's like, I need you to like signal my way of your liberation. You know, like, for example, one of the ways that we do that is if somebody talks more, they're somehow more vulnerable. No, it depends. We have a verbally focused Western ideal that if somebody speaks about their emotions more, but people share their emotions all sorts of ways. They use their bodies, they use, you know, there's different levels of you know, readiness and different forms. And we have these like biases about what being vulnerable means, being authentic. So when we say the word authentic, it's like, it's a big concept that is about, first and foremost, the responsibility of the therapist to be attuned to whatever the client needs. It's not about these pretenses about you ought to be signaling, you know, some sort of like, you know, vulnerability in this way. This is the theme. But I really like this point, this question about like, what about our own structures that suffocate us? And Professor Pennant and I, we talk weekly. It's one of the ways that we keep ethical to the model itself. We have to be weighing what's happening for us and teaching the class so that we can be isomorphic to what's happening to the students. And one of the things that came up, and like we've been tracking our own theme, so I'll talk a little bit about like one that came up is, what if your own graduate program or your own institution doesn't have the culture of the thing that you're trying to do, right? And so you can resist it, and you can push against it, but in the meantime, stuff is happening to you, and you have symptoms because you're trying to push up against this thing, and you're suffocating in your own ways. And I had a good friend say to me, Zain, what if you spend all of your time, I mean, I'm just going to be blunt. What if you spend all of your time, you know, proving to your white colleagues that they should be more attuned and that they should center things in a different way. And then you're sitting there rehashing and repeating yourself constantly. And like, then you don't do all the work that you actually need to be doing with your life. And, you know, then we feel tenuous and constrained. It's like in capitalism, it's like, oh crap, well, I have to make this decision because I have to get like, I got to pay for things, I guess. And so, and this was better than that other institution, I guess, or on paper, it looked that way. But then it still has an effect on you. So, you know, this is something we talk about, like, what if, yeah, I don't know. There's that thing that happens where the spaces that we occupy also impact us in a way that does constrain us. I mean, that's a real thing, and it does impact us. And I think that's true in a lot of different institutional realities. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what came up for me.
I'll say really quick Dr. Shamoon, you have a lot of good friends with wisdom. But I think let's talk about authenticity. I think when it comes down to it too, is that when we know ourselves and we know what environments are best for us to be to have healthiness around, we also know where we should do it and where we can't do it. And that causes us also to seek out community, right, that will shelter and foster what we need to be able to talk about in order to feel better about ourselves too. So I think that there's this level of, again, it goes back to accountability that we were talking to about, like, if you really know yourself, you really know what you need and you will know where to get that too.
Dr. Zeshan, did you want to talk about authenticity in the encounter or the kind of in therapy as well? Or maybe there's questions from the audience too. We have just about 5 more minutes.
Yeah, we can take question. I think there is really well points. I really love it. I'm learning a lot about authenticity. Yeah, we can take questions.
Great. Okay, do we have questions from the audience? Because I have been kind of making the presenters to engage with each other. It's been a fantastic conversation. We've had a lot of chats about, really enjoying the conversation from the audience. Does anyone have specific questions about the presentations or the, anything that the presenters have said? You could just use the hand raise function or even just speak right away. Do you have questions for each other, maybe?
I think just one thing I, want to highlight when the concept of repair we talk about, and mostly I'm talking not at the system level, but at a, patient-therapist relationship level, parent-child, or the patient-family interaction level. So there are 2 ways, when we talk about repair. One is, maybe come up with more suggestions, more solutions, which I, in a simple way, call it a problem fixing model, that, this is the problem. Okay, let's try to fix it. But the other, which I think Dr. Pennant mentioned, is through the connectedness. I think focusing more on the relationship rather than, what can I do next to fix this problem. So I think with focusing more on the relationship, focusing more on building connectedness, focusing more on understanding what is the meaning behind, this mismatch, rather than, let's, do something different to fix it.
That's a wonderful comment. We did have a last question and then we'll break, which was how to deal with clients that have an unhealthy attachment to the therapist, right? Maybe that's a continuation of the comment you just made. How would we respond to that? What do you guys, what do the presenters say?
I'll jump in really quick about that. I think that an unhealthy attachment, I think that there's a part of me that has trepidation around qualifying unhealthy, but I think that if in a way that it is counterproductive to the person having independence and exercising agency, right? That's the question and conversation I would have, right? And usually that stuff is about fear, right? We represent something that's good for these people, for these individuals, and for people in general, and they get used to that and they like that and it feels safe for them for that. So the next conversation isn't about how you might be addicted to the relationship, but more about how can we further out some of the work that you've been doing between you and I, because there's a level of healthiness around identifying good people, right? And someone that is able to help you do and further things. And so if you're able to, expand the conversation as to what does that look like, right? Again, changing language. Language is not neutral. And if we are able to not pathologize things in that particular manner, that may actually free up people to do something different.
Wonderful. That's well said. And I think we'll have to have you have the last word, at least for this panel, because we do have a panel at 3:15 and people would probably love a 5-7 minute break. So thank you so much to all of our panelists, to Dr. Younis, to Dr. Shamoon, to Dr. Pennant, and Dr. Zeshan. It was just a wonderful, kind of very complimentary, sort of integrated, wonderful experience to hear all of your presentations and to hear about sort of, what we need to do next to resist and to also repair. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful panel, and I'm honored to have facilitated this great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.